Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. This week's show is going to be actually entirely focused on the follow-up and the ongoings on with the Tavush to Yerevan march. The big rally, which started off the actions in Yerevan, had somewhere, depending on how you believe, a low end of 20,000, high end of 30,000. The following days, the rallies have continued with less numbers of people showing up. That sort of has segued into actions of civil disobedience, mostly around Yerevan, some of them under regions. Now I want to go over the demands that the Sarpazan and his followers have made since last Thursday. They have moved on from complaining about the border demarcation to demanding regime change. They're asking for a vote of confidence in the parliament to get rid of the prime minister, which is frankly is going to be difficult because of the significant majorities that the prime minister enjoys with his own party in parliament. They're demanding a transitional government to be set up. They've come up with a multi-point program of changes that they would want to see from everything from international relations to diaspora, specifically about international policies. They actually want to continue expanding our relationships with the West, but they want to do so while keeping all of our old relationships and not harming any relations with what they call former allies. Obviously, they mean Russia with that. All of this is actually easier said than done. What they've pledged to do is to continue having an active program of civil disobedience, and which has continued with moderate intensity, mostly in Yerevan, but sometimes out of it. Hundreds have been detained during the demonstrations, mostly for blocking streets. Then move on to the Archbishop himself publicly saying that he's actually willing to serve as Prime Minister.
Ես ասում եմ, ոչ սկզբում ոչ ցանկություն ունեմ, ոչ հավակնություն եւ սկզբունքներ ունեմ, որոնք դժվար է խախտել։ Շատ բարձ։ Անգամ եթե ժողովուրդը ցանկանա եւ դա լինի Աստծո կամքը եւ հայոց հայրապետը օրհնի,
we have all seen this movie before. Let's watch.
من دولت تعیین میکنم. من تو دهن این دولت میزنم. من دولت تعیین میکنم. من به پشتیبانی این ملت دولت تعیین میکنم. من به واسطه اینکه ملت مرا قبول دارد.
As Marx said, in history, everything happens twice. The first time is tragedy, and the second time as farce. Now let's move on to what all of this means. Most likely, none of these actions are going to go beyond what we have now and essentially be an actual real serious threat to this government. This is despite the fact that the angst that has produced these marches has much wider support than indicated by the actual numbers of people on the street. Now, why is that the case? It's because of the messaging of the movement and some tactical mistakes that have sort of limited the pool of people that are likely to support it. All of this despite the fact that there's a clear openness by significant segments of voters to an alternative to this current government. Let's study the issue of messaging. If you actually look at polling, if you want to come up with the broadest range of support among the Armenian public, the voting public, there's 4 points that you need to focus on. One is to be nationalist. 2 is to be focused on national defense and strengthening the country's defenses. Number 3 is to be supportive of enhancing of our relationships with the West, obviously within reason. And lastly, and most importantly in many ways, to be critical of Russia, again, within reason. If the rhetoric that was coming out of the big rally on Thursday and the following days was actually far more inclusive of these 4 points, the actual number of people would have actually doubled from Thursday to Friday as far as the widening the pool of supporters. Instead, if you listen to the messaging from the Sarpazan and his friends and the other speakers, they got number one covered. They're very high on nationalism. That they have in the bag. Moving on to the second topic, there's nothing in their rhetoric about changing the balance of power militarily. There's no calls for national mobilization for people to come together in some kind of effort to enhance our defenses. Moreover, there's not a single critical word of Russia or anything specific about enhancing our relationships with the West in any detailed fashion or any particular strong way of saying it. You don't hear that at all. Tactically, the mistake that they made is immediately after this march, the Sarpazan marched into the offices of President Robert Kocharyan in the full view of the media. You combine these two and you're really narrowing the pool of people that are likely to support these efforts rather than broadening it. Making sense of all this, the first question we need to ask ourselves in this particular moment in history is, why is it that significant segments of society can imagine that a political figure that almost nobody knew a few weeks ago is capable of solving or bringing us the change that we need? All of this sounds eerily familiar. The truth is that the organizer of these marches and the events of the last week is actually not Archbishop Bagrat, it's not the ARF, it's not former President Kocharyan or the Russian state operatives. It is actually the current government and its leader. Obviously, I mean this in a figurative way. It is this government with its actions and importantly, rhetoric in regards to things that are said and not said, things that are done or not done, that has created genuine public anger that has made this current moment possible. There's a vacuum in our political system and it's created by this government. Let's go over the things that people are looking for and they're not getting from this government today. Point one, people want a commander-in-chief. Yes, we all want a leader who seeks peace and works on that, but one who is also willing to speak honestly about the nature of our enemies and one that gives clear timelines on when we can have deterrence capacities and close the military gap to an extent that all of us can feel safe. In short, what the public wants is a leader who can marry the language of peace with the language of strength. Number two, people are tired of having their country humiliated. There's a limit to what people are willing to put up with. And if we are going to be humiliated, they want to know what is being done to close the gap, to change that situation. And one of the things that we see is we know there's significant reforms going on in our military, but frankly, this government is, for the most part, too afraid to talk about it. Number three, fear simply cannot be a basis of making policy. You cannot make decisions or appear to be making decisions to please tyrants abroad, because that is a never-ending process. Every little boy who survived elementary school knows that ultimately, in the long run, there's only one way to deal with bullies. Everything that our state does, night and day, should get us to a point where we can shout a loud no and back it up. Number four, don't be afraid to use the word Artsakh. You either take concrete positions on this issue, or this will be used by your opponents to undo your government on very legitimate grounds. You should move immediately to organize a donor conference to help with the people that have been driven out, ethnically cleansed out of Artsakh. Number two, you need to speak clearly of their international rights to return, no matter how unrealistic it is in the short run. We need to weaponize the events of last September and October as the bloody shirt that we wave against the world to put both of our friends and our enemies on their back legs. This will actually enhance our security situation, since the more we're talking about the criminality of last year, the less we're talking about things, for example, like the corridor, that we don't want to talk about. There's obviously also a very clear public demand to punish the criminality that we suffered last year. In some ways, this government, and in fact the world, underestimate the trauma of the ethnic cleansing from last year. Those 2 weeks, in fact, I can say will dictate politics in this region for generations to come. It is rather incredibly naive to believe that the second Armenian genocide is going to be forgotten or pushed under the proverbial political rug. This trauma, if not treated with justice, will create a politics that both us and our neighbors will come to regret. I know that the primary fear of this government is that the Artsakh refugees will be the frontline troops of regime change, whether it's controlled by the Nakhgins, by the Russians, or whoever. But if that happens, whose fault would that really be? The politics of this are actually quite simple. In short, you either weaponize the Artsakh issue for your purposes, or it will be weaponized against you. Lastly, enough of the patronizing lectures. Mr. Prime Minister, you're not a university lecturer, and we're not your students. we understand very well the difference between the Armenian Republic of today and the historic Armenian nation. In fact, if you live in Armenia, or specifically in Yerevan, you can actually see it outside of your window every day. Furthermore, none of us wants to hear any more about our national symbols changing, what is in our constitution or what isn't in our constitution, or recounting how many people were murdered during the genocide, if all of these topics are being discussed to appease foreign fascists. Lastly, your task is not to make the world's case to us, which somehow always means that we give up something for getting nothing in return. It is your job to make our case to the world. In conclusion, the Prime Minister says that the choice is between demarcation and war. Well, not really. Let's learn from history. From Adolf to Ilham, peace with dictators has never come from border demarcations, summit meetings, or signed agreements, but only from the guns that are lined up behind unmarked or marked borders. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Insights.